They thought humans were just legends. Until they saw the fleet coming. The file was already open on my screen when Elder Ossak walked in and told me to close it. That was the first sign I should have paid attention to. I am Vale 9, attaché to the 3rd Diplomatic Branch of the Galactic Conclave, and I had spent the last 4 hours staring at a record so old that the encoding format no longer existed in any standard library. I had needed 3 separate decryption programs and one very irritated archive technician named Pole to crack it open. What I found inside did not feel like history. It felt like a warning that had arrived 3,000 years too late. The record was filed under a category label that translated, loosely, into something like remembered threats. Not confirmed threats. Not active threats, remembered, as if whoever created the filing system had been trying to say, we know this was real, but we would very much like to forget it. The entry was thin. Only 11 pages of original text remained uncorrupted. But those 11 pages described a species called the Terrans, and every sentence made the base of my neck go cold. I should explain something about myself before I go further. I am not easily unsettled. I grew up in the outer settlement rings of the Keth home system, where the power cuts out twice a week and cargo haulers come through with news that is already 2 months old by the time it reaches us. I studied interstellar diplomacy for 6 years at the Conclave Academy, where they trained us to stay composed in rooms full of species who considered Keth to be roughly equivalent to talking furniture. I had sat across a negotiating table from a Vreth Dominion admiral who had 3 functioning mouths and used all of them simultaneously when he was making a point. I did not flinch then, but 11 pages about the Terrans, and I was gripping the edge of my desk. The record described a species that had originated on a single planet in a mid-range solar system, unremarkable in every astronomical sense. They were biological, carbon-based, bilaterally symmetrical, warm-blooded. By all standard metrics, they should have been a minor civilization at best. The kind of species the Conclave catalogued, observed from a distance, and left to develop on their own timeline for another few centuries before making formal contact. They were not that. The record cited something called the Meridian Survey, conducted approximately 4,000 years ago by a now-extinct species called the Ovari, who had apparently been the first to make contact with the Terrans. The survey notes were brief and increasingly frantic. The Ovari observers had expected to find a primitive agrarian society. Instead, they found a species that had, in the span of roughly 300 years, gone from burning wood for heat to splitting atoms for power. That rate of advancement was not just unusual. According to the note written in the margin by some long-dead Ovari scientist, it was, and I am translating carefully here, not consistent with natural development. Someone in the archive had underlined that sentence in red ink. The ink had faded, but the pressure of the original stroke was still visible, pressed deep into the page. The Ovari made formal contact. By all accounts, it went reasonably well. The Terrans were curious, aggressive in the way that exploratory species often are, and almost alarmingly adaptable. They asked questions constantly. They borrowed technology and improved it before returning it. They were, the survey noted, extremely difficult to predict. Then the Ovari disappeared, not just from the record, from existence. Their entire civilization, 47 colony worlds and a home system that had been inhabited for 2 million years, went silent within the span of a single generation. The cause was listed in the archive as undetermined, but the timing was noted, carefully, by whoever had compiled this file. The Ovari vanished approximately 60 years after their first contact with the Terrans. I want to be clear. The record did not accuse the Terrans of anything. There was no evidence presented of any connection, but the proximity of those two facts, first contact and then silence, sat in the file like a splinter under a fingernail. The next section of the record was even older, translated from a language that no longer had any living speakers. It described something the source civilization had called the Long Silence, a period of roughly 200 years during which the Terrans had simply stopped appearing in any observed sector of space. No ships, no signals, no evidence of expansion, as if an entire species had decided, collectively and simultaneously, to stop existing. Other civilizations had assumed they were gone. Some had celebrated, though the record was diplomatic enough not to say why. The Conclave's predecessor body had officially listed the Terrans as extinct approximately 3,000 years ago, following a review of all available evidence. The review had taken 11 days. The conclusion had been unanimous. Extinct. Case closed. File under remembered threats and leave it there. I read all of this, and then I sat very still for a long time. Because here was the thing that the official extinction review had apparently not considered, or had considered and chosen to ignore. The records describing the Terrans did not read like records about a species that was declining. There was no mention of disease sweeping through their populations. No mention of resource collapse or social disintegration or any of the thousand, ordinary ways that civilizations came apart. The last confirmed observations of Terran activity showed a species at the peak of its expansion. Fast ships, thriving colonies, a people in the middle of becoming something extraordinary. Species at the peak of their expansion did not simply stop. They either grew, or they were stopped. And nothing in the archive suggested that anyone had stopped them. Elder Ossak came in as I was reading the margin notes on the final page. He was carrying his afternoon meal in a sealed container, which meant he had come from the upper floors, which meant he had been in a senior briefing. He looked at my screen. He looked at me. He set down his meal without opening it. "Close that file, Vale," he said. "I just found it this morning," I said. "It was in the open archive. Miss Field under astronomical surveys. I know where it was filed. Did you know it was there?" He did not answer that question. He walked to my desk and leaned over and closed the file himself, using my own terminal, which was technically a procedural violation of personal workspace protocols. He did not seem concerned about that. "Those records are 3,000 years old," he said. "The species they describe no longer exists. There is nothing useful in that file. The advancement rate alone is worth studying," I said. "If a species can develop at that speed, then the models we use to classify emerging civilizations are incomplete. The models are fine." Elder Ossak, the Ovari disappeared 60 years after. The Ovari collapsed due to internal resource mismanagement. That is the accepted finding. I looked at him for a moment. He was not a dishonest person, Ossak. He was a careful one. There is a difference. Dishonest people tell you things they know to be false. Careful people tell you only the things they have decided you need to know. And they have usually decided that you do not need to know very much. "What are you not telling me?" I asked. He picked up his meal. He looked at the closed screen. "I am telling you that the Terrans are a myth, that the file is a miscompiled collection of unreliable ancient sources, and that your time would be better spent preparing the briefing notes for the Vreth trade delegation arriving next week." He moved toward the door. "I am also telling you, and I want you to hear this clearly, that some doors are better left shut, not because of what is behind them, but because of what has been waiting behind them for a very, very long time." He left. I sat in the quiet of my office for a long time after that. The terminal screen was dark. The file was closed. I thought about what he had said. Some doors are better left shut, not because of what is behind them, but because of what has been waiting behind them. That was a strange way to describe a myth. That was a strange way to describe something that did not exist. I thought about the advancement rates. I thought about the Ovari, 2 million years of civilization gone silent in a generation. I thought about the word remembered in the filing category. Not historical, not archived, remembered. As if the person who created that category had wanted to make sure someone, someday, did not make the mistake of forgetting. I opened a new search window on a secondary terminal, one that did not log to the Senior Oversight Archive. I typed in a single word, Terran. The results loaded slowly. Most of them were the same file I had just been told to close. But at the bottom of the list, there was something else. A cross-reference so old it did not even have a proper timestamp, just an approximate date range that spanned a century. It was a single line, attached to a navigational hazard report from a deep space survey team operating near the outer edge of the known galaxy. The line read, "Object identified as artificial construction, origin unknown, materials composition not matching any cataloged civilization. Hull markings partially legible. Closest translation, Earth." The survey team had filed it under navigational hazards and moved on. Nobody had gone back. I saved the coordinates to my personal drive. Then I sat there in the dark of my office, with the distant lights of 100-star systems glittering through the window above my desk. And I thought about a species that had been called a legend for 3,000 years. Legends, in my experience, do not leave hull scorch marks in the rock, and they do not wait. The signal came in on a frequency that had not been used by any known civilization in recorded history, and it came from a direction that every star chart in the Conclave database listed as empty space. I know this because I was the one who found it. It was not supposed to be my job. I was a diplomatic attaché, not a signals analyst. My clearance level covered trade negotiations, preliminary contact protocols, and archive research. Standard mid-level access, the kind that got you into interesting rooms but not interesting conversations. The signals division was 3 floors above me, and staffed by people who had spent decades learning to read the electromagnetic whispers of deep space. I had no business being anywhere near their work, But 6 weeks after I found the Terran file, I had quietly cultivated a friendship with a junior analyst in signals named Owen. He was young, newer to the conclave than I was, and he had the particular energy of someone who had grown up reading about the great mysteries of the galaxy, and had not yet had those enthusiasms, politely discouraged by a superior. He also had a habit of eating his lunch in the archive corridor, which was where I happened to walk every day between the hours of midday and the first afternoon cycle. We talked about history. He talked about signals. I listened carefully and asked good questions, which is the only diplomatic skill that transfers cleanly to every other field of work. So when Owen found the signal and did not know what to do with it, he came to me. He arrived at my office at an hour when most of the floor was empty, carrying a data pad that he held the way people hold things they are not entirely sure they should be holding. He sat down across from my desk. He put the pad face down on the surface between us, which told me he had already thought about whether to show it to me, and had not fully resolved this question. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me if I am overreacting." "You are not the kind of person who overreacts," I said, which was true. "Show me." He turned the pad over. The signal had been received 48 hours earlier by the relay station designated Outer Post 7, a largely automated facility positioned at what the Conclave's navigational authority called the edge of the practical boundary, the outermost point, from which communication with the interior of known space was still reliable. Beyond Outer Post 7 there was nothing on any chart. Uncharted void. Dead space. The signal was 47 seconds long. It had been broadcast once, then gone silent. Owen's team had spent 48 hours trying to decode it, and had produced exactly nothing. The encoding system did not match any protocol in any active or historical database. It was, according to the official analysis report filed by Owen's supervisor, most likely a natural phenomenon, a pulsar or magnetar producing a structured, seeming burst that was actually just complex interference. Owen did not believe that. He believed it because he had seen the second layer. "My supervisor ran the standard decryption suite," he said. "It found nothing, but the standard suite only checks against known encoding systems." He paused. "I ran it against the cipher from the Terran archive." I went very still. "How did you know about the Terran archive?" I asked. He looked at me with an expression that, on his young face, was quite serious. "Because you mentioned it," he said, 3 weeks ago, in the corridor. You said you had found something interesting, and then immediately changed the subject, which is what people do when they have found something they are not supposed to talk about. And then I went and found it myself." He was, as I said, not the kind of person who overreacted. He was also apparently the kind of person who paid close attention. "Play it," I said. He keyed the pad. Signal filled the small speaker, 47 seconds of what sounded, at first like layered static, but Owen had already run it through the Terran cipher. At the bottom of the pad screen, the translation scrolled slowly as the audio played. The first line read, "We have been listening." The second line read, "We know you found the file." The third line read, "We are ready if you are." Then it gave coordinates. I sat with that for a long moment. The office around me felt very small suddenly, and the silence of the corridor outside felt very large. "The second line," I said carefully. "We know you found the file." "Yes," said Owen. "That is personalized." "Yes, which means they are not broadcasting a general signal to anyone who might receive it. They are broadcasting a signal aimed at someone specific." "That is what I think," said Owen. He looked at the pad. "Vale, if this is real, if the Terrans are real, and they have been monitoring communications inside the conclave boundary, then they have been watching us for a very long time without us knowing. And they chose to speak now. To you, I thought about Elder Osek. I thought about the words he had used. Some doors are better left shut. Not because of what is behind them, but because of what has been waiting behind them for a very, very long time. I need you to not file this officially yet," I said. Owen nodded, which told me he had already made that decision before he came to my office. "There is something else," he said. He reached over and scrolled the pad to a secondary analysis screen. I ran the coordinates through the navigational database. According to every chart we have, those coordinates are empty space. No stars. No charted objects. "Nothing but?" I said. But I cross-referenced it with a navigational hazard report from about 900 years ago. A survey team that went further out than most. He turned the pad toward me. They logged an anomaly. Artificial construction. Origin unknown. Hull markings partially legible. I looked at the report. I had seen this before. The single line I had found in the archive 6 weeks ago. But Owen had found the full report. Not the one-line summary. The full report. It was 40 pages long. The survey team had not simply noted the anomaly and moved on. They had spent 3 weeks investigating. They had taken detailed scans. They had cataloged structures on a scale that their equipment could barely measure. They had found what appeared to be a ring station with a circumference larger than some planets. They had found what appeared to be multiple ship signatures inside a debris field that, on closer analysis, was not a debris field at all but a kind of camouflage, a deliberate arrangement of material designed to look like wreckage from a distance. And at the center of it all they had found a single object floating free, a capsule of some kind, sealed, undamaged, on its surface. In a script the survey team could not read, were markings. The team had photographed them and attached the images to their report. Owen had run those markings through the Terran cipher as well. The translation was 2 words. Not yet. The capsule had been left there, waiting. I sat back in my chair. My hands, I noticed, were completely steady, which surprised me. I had expected to feel afraid. Instead, I felt something closer to the feeling you get when you have been working on a problem for a very long time, and a piece finally clicks into the right place. Not relief, not joy, just the quiet, clear sensation of understanding. They left a message in a capsule 900 years ago, I said, saying not yet, and now they are sending a signal saying we are ready. That is what the evidence suggests, said Owen. They have been watching the conclave, watching us specifically, waiting for a specific moment. Yes, what moment? Owen was quiet for a beat. Then he pulled up a third screen. That is what I spent last night trying to figure out. I went back through the archive and pulled every major political event in conclave history over the last century. And I found a pattern. He handed me the pad. Every time the Vreth Dominion has moved toward an expansion campaign, the kind that ends with someone else's civilization, absorbed or erased, there has been a quiet period. No signals, no anomalies, nothing unusual. And then, about 20 years before the campaign reaches its critical phase, something small happens. An old record surfaces. A navigational anomaly gets logged. Something just small enough to notice if you are looking. I looked at the timeline on his screen. I looked at the current date. The Vreth Dominion's next expansion phase, I said. Current projections say it reaches critical momentum in 18 cycles, said Owen. 18 cycles, 18 years. I thought about a species that had faked its own death to avoid a war that would have destroyed half the galaxy. I thought about a people who had spent 3,000 years in silence, watching, waiting, preparing. I thought about a capsule floating in dead space for 9 centuries, carrying 2 words. Not yet. They had been watching the Dominion. They had been watching the conclave. They had been waiting for the right moment to speak. A moment when speaking might actually change something, rather than simply starting the war they had spent 3 millennia avoiding. And they had decided that moment was now. Within 48 hours of Owen's visit to my office, the signal became impossible to contain. A second relay station had independently received it, and that station's logs were on a senior oversight channel. By the following morning, the Conclave Signals Division had officially acknowledged an unidentified transmission from beyond the practical boundary. By afternoon, the Vreth Dominion's representative to the Conclave had filed a formal security inquiry. By evening, the senior council was in emergency session. I was not invited to the emergency session, but Owen was, because he was the analyst who had first flagged the signal, and he fed me a quiet summary afterward through a personal message. The council had voted 4-3 to classify the signal as a potential threat. The Vreth Dominion's representative, a broad-shouldered figure named Commander Drav, had argued for an immediate military response. He had used the word neutralize 3 times in his statement. He had also made a point of noting that the coordinates of the signal corresponded to an undefended region of space with no conclave presence, which meant, in his view, that whoever sent it had chosen their position deliberately to signal a lack of accountability. The 4th vote for the threat classification had come from Elder Ossak. When Owen told me that, I felt something tighten in my chest. Ossak had known something about the Terran file. He had told me to leave the door shut. And then, when the door opened anyway, he had voted to send weapons through it first. I sat in my office that night and thought about 3,000 years of silence. I thought about a people who had watched and waited and chosen, each time, not to act, until the moment they decided the cost of silence was finally higher than the cost of being seen. I thought about what kind of people chose patience on that scale. What kind of people watched civilizations rise and fall around them for 30 centuries and said, not yet. Not until the moment was right. I did not think they were the kind of people who would appreciate being greeted with weapons. I booked passage on the next available neutral observer vessel headed toward the outer boundary. I used my diplomatic credentials, which were valid for travel to any point inside or adjacent to conclave-monitored space, and the coordinates Owen had shared with me were just barely inside the outer monitoring perimeter. The booking processed without a flag. I packed a single bag. I brought the full Terran archive copied to a personal drive. I brought Owen's analysis. Because I had carried it for years and never quite been able to explain why, a small printed photograph of deep space, a long exposure image of the region beyond the outer boundary, taken by a survey probe and given to me by a professor at the academy who had said when he handed it to me, "The most interesting things are always in the places we haven't looked yet." The observer vessel was named the Quiet Distance. It carried 11 crew and space for 8 passengers. I was the only passenger who boarded with full knowledge of where we were actually going. As we lifted out of the dock and the curve of the station fell away below the viewports, I looked out into the dark between the stars and I thought about the signal. 47 seconds. 3 lines. A set of coordinates. "We have been listening. We know you found the file. We are ready if you are." I had not answered them. There had been no mechanism to answer them. But I was going, and I thought perhaps that was answer enough. I thought perhaps they had counted on someone like me, someone small and curious and just stubborn enough to get on a ship. The Vreth destroyer fleet had departed 6 hours before us, 20 ships, armed to full capacity, moving fast on a direct intercept course. I sat at the viewport as the stars stretched and blurred into the long white lines of faster-than-light travel, and I thought about what it meant to be the galaxy's first line of diplomacy when the second line was 20 destroyers with weapons charged. I thought about doors. I thought about what had been waiting behind this one. And I thought about 2 words on a capsule in dead space, left there 900 years ago by people who had known somehow that this moment would eventually come. Not yet, now. The Quiet Distance dropped out of faster-than-light travel 17 minutes after the Vreth destroyer fleet. I know this because I was watching the transit clock on the passenger deck display, and because 17 minutes was the exact margin I had calculated based on the fleet's last log speed and our own transit settings. I had asked the captain, a careful woman named Audria, to hold our approach steady at the outer sensor range. She had agreed without asking me why, which told me she had her own suspicions about what we were heading toward. Nothing could have prepared any of us for what we saw when the stars snapped back into focus. I had grown up in space. I had seen stations as large as cities, cargo haulers so long their bow and stern sat in different gravity wells, the great orbital platforms of the Vreth Dominion that could blot out a sun from the surface of a nearby moon. I thought I had a reasonable sense of scale. I thought I understood what large meant. I was wrong. The structures in front of us did not register as structures at first. My mind tried to process them as geography, as natural formations, as asteroids, as anything that fit into a category it already knew. There were ring-shaped objects so vast that the curvature was not visible from our position. They simply appeared as straight lines of material stretching from one edge of the viewport to the other. There were cylindrical forms rotating slowly in the void, each one long enough to hold a mid-sized city along its inner surface, and wide enough that you could fit the Quiet Distance inside one of them several thousand times over. There were docking structures, or what I assumed were docking structures, that extended like the branches of enormous trees from central hubs the size of small moons. And there were ships, not a patrol, not a fleet in the standard military sense of the word. This was something that did not have a name in any military vocabulary I had ever studied. The vessels varied enormously in size and design, but they shared a quality that I noticed before I could name it. They were coherent. They moved together in a way that was not mechanical, not programmed but responsive, the way a single organism moves when it has decided to do something. Thousands of them, perhaps more, sitting in perfect stillness, arranged in a formation that seemed both entirely natural and deeply, profoundly deliberate. I gripped the viewport frame and tried to breathe normally. Adria's voice came over the passenger deck speaker. "We are holding position," she said. Her voice was steady, which I respected enormously. "I want all passengers to remain calm. We are registering no weapons locks on our vessel. We are registering a great many things, but not that." On the far side of the viewport, the Vreth destroyer fleet had come to a full stop. 20 ships, each one carrying enough firepower to level a mid-sized settlement, hanging motionless in front of what amounted to a civilization's worth of infrastructure. It looked, I thought, like a child standing at the edge of an ocean for the first time, and realizing, very suddenly, that the ocean was larger than anything they had ever imagined. Then a single vessel separated from the nearest human structure and began moving toward the destroyer fleet. It was smaller than the others, much smaller, approximately the size of one of the Vreth destroyers, perhaps a little longer. It had no visible weapons ports. It was moving at a speed that was unhurried but purposeful. The speed of something that was not rushing because it had no need to rush. Its hull was a deep dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and along its flanks were markings in a script I recognized from the archive photographs. Terran, the vessel broadcast on an open frequency. Every ship in the area received it simultaneously. The voice was female, calm, and entirely human. "This is Commander Nora Kane of the vessel called the Patience," she said. "We are transmitting on all available frequencies in all 47 languages currently in use by Conclave member species. We have been monitoring your communications for some time and we are familiar with all of them." A brief pause. "We are pleased to make formal contact. We ask that you hold your current positions and refrain from any weapons discharge. We would prefer to begin this conversation without anyone getting hurt." There was a silence across all channels that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the Vreth fleet opened fire. I do not know what I expected. I think part of me had held on to a hope that the Dominion's commander would pause, would assess, would look at the sheer scale of what was in front of him, and conclude that firing weapons was not the optimal opening move. I think part of me had believed that the evidence of Terran capability visible in every direction would be enough. It was not enough. 40 weapons discharges went out from 20 destroyers simultaneously. The kind of volley that could crack the hull of a Conclave battle station. The kind of firepower that the Dominion's commanders had always treated as the ultimate argument, the statement that ended conversations before they could become complicated. For exactly 4 seconds, the weapons fire was in transit between the Vreth fleet and the single human vessel. Then the weapons fire stopped existing, not deflected, not absorbed by a shield, not dodged, stopped existing. The energy simply ceased to be in the space it had been occupying. One moment it was there, bright and fast and certain, and the next moment it was not, and the Vreth destroyers were sitting in the silence that followed with nothing changed, and nothing accomplished. Commander Nora Kane's voice came back over the open frequency. "I understand this is a stressful moment," she said. "We do not hold the discharge against you. The decision to fire under conditions of uncertainty is one we are familiar with." Another pause. "However, I want to be clear about something. We will not fire back. We are not going to hurt your crew. We are asking you, sincerely and without conditions, to stop." Commander Drav of the Vreth fleet answered her. His voice over the open channel was controlled but tight. "Stand down and identify your conclave authorization," he said. "This region of space falls under security review by order of the Galactic Council." "We are aware of the Council's review," said Kane. "We prompted it." A longer silence. "You are not authorized to operate in this sector," said Drav. "We have been operating in this sector," said Kane. And there was something in her voice that was not quite amusement and not quite patience, but something that sat between the two for approximately 3,000 years. "Authorization was not something we required." Drav's response was another weapons discharge, this one larger, coordinated across all 20 ships, targeting the Patience from multiple angles simultaneously, a strike pattern designed for saturation, to make evasion mathematically impossible. The weapons fire stopped existing, exactly as before. The Patience had not moved. Not a single degree of deviation. It had simply remained in place and declined to be hit, in a way that suggested the concept of being hit was something it had considered and set aside as irrelevant. I was watching all of this through the viewport of a neutral observer vessel that was holding very still indeed, and I was aware that my hands were pressing so hard against the frame that my fingers had gone pale. Not from fear, exactly. From something more complicated. From the specific sensation of watching something that rewrote every assumption you had ever made about what was possible. Then the Vreth destroyers went dark. One by one, in a sequence that took approximately 30 seconds from first to last, their running lights died, their engines went cold, their communication systems fell silent, not destroyed. The hulls remained intact, undamaged, exactly as they had been. The ships simply stopped operating, as if someone had reached into each one and turned it off. The open frequency crackled. "Your crew are unharmed," said Commander Kane. "Life support remains active on all 20 vessels. You are simply parked for the moment." A pause that felt, even over the transmission, like a genuine moment of thought. "We will return your ships to full function within the hour. We ask only that when they are returned you use them to go home." Another silence. Then Drav's voice came back and something in it had changed. The authority was still there, the training, the discipline. But under all of it, very audible to anyone who had spent years learning to listen carefully, was something else. "What are you?" he asked. "We are human," said Commander Kane. "We are Terran. We are the species your historical records classify as extinct." She let that settle for a moment. "We are not extinct. We have simply been waiting for a conversation worth having." She hailed the quiet distance directly then. "My name Vale 9, Diplomatic Attaché, 3rd Branch." She knew exactly who was on the observer vessel and exactly where I was sitting. The personalization of the hail made every crew member on the quiet distance turn to look at me. "Vale 9, she said. "We know you came here to talk. We appreciate that more than you know. Would you be willing to come aboard?" Audria looked at me from the doorway of the passenger deck. She raised an eyebrow. I looked out the viewport at the patients, sitting calm and dark-hulled in the middle of more concentrated capability than anything the Conclave had ever assembled. I thought about a signal that had known my name. I thought about a file misfiled under astronomical surveys. I thought about an old record 11 pages long and a word pressed deep into the page in faded red ink. "Yes," I said. The docking process was unlike anything in standard protocol. The patients extended a connection sleeve that adjusted its dimensions in real time to match the quiet distance's airlock specifications. Specifications that were not public information and that had been manufactured on a Keth orbital platform only 7 years ago. They had current data, detailed current data. I filed that fact away and did not let myself think too hard about what it implied. The airlock opened. Commander Nora Kane was standing on the other side. She was, by any standard measure, a human being. Bilaterally symmetrical, warm-blooded, approximately the height and build described in the archive records. Dark hair, light brown skin, eyes that were a shade of brown dark enough to be almost black. She was wearing a uniform that was simple and functional, with no insignia I recognized. She looked to be, in terms of apparent physical age, somewhere in her middle decades. She was smiling. I had read, in the archive, that humans smiled when they were happy. I would later learn that they also smiled in a dozen other situations, for a dozen other reasons, and that a smile from a human was one of the most complex social signals in the known galaxy, because it could mean so many different things simultaneously. But I did not know that yet. What I saw was a woman who looked genuinely, warmly pleased to see me. "Vale," she said. "Not Vale 9, just Vale, as if we already knew each other. Thank you for coming. I know that took courage. It took a transport booking and reasonable use of my credentials," I said. She laughed. The laugh was immediate and unguarded, and it filled the small airlock corridor in a way that made the space feel larger. "I like you already," she said. "Come in. There is a lot to talk about." The interior of the patients was not what I expected. I had anticipated something austere, something functional and military. What I found was a working vessel that felt lived in, not messy but inhabited. The corridors had what I later learned to call personal touches. Small objects mounted on wall brackets, framed images, a long narrow window at a corridor intersection that had been placed, as far as I could tell, for no reason except that the view of the starfield outside was beautiful from that angle. We sat in a small room that served as both a briefing space and what Kane called a lounge, and she poured 2 cups of something warm and placed one in front of me, without asking if I wanted it. I did want it. It was extraordinary. I did not ask what it was. "You know why we chose now," I said. It was not quite a question. "We know about the Dominion's timeline," she said. 18 cycles to critical momentum. If the expansion proceeds unchecked, 4 independent civilizations are at risk of absorption or elimination. We have watched that pattern play out before. Her voice did not change in tone, but something behind her eyes shifted. "We will not watch it again. You have been watching for 3,000 years, I said. You could have intervened at any point." "We could have," she agreed. "We chose not to." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because intervention at the wrong moment does not solve the problem. It relocates it. We intervened when the Ovari were threatened, early, before we were ready, without the tools we needed. We failed. The Ovari are gone. And we learned something from that failure that took us a very long time to be willing to accept." She looked at me steadily. "Strength used too early teaches the people around you to depend on strength. It does not teach them to build their own. We did not want a galaxy full of civilizations that stayed alive because we protected them. We wanted a galaxy full of civilizations capable of protecting themselves, with a little help at the moment when it actually mattered." I thought about that. I thought about everything I had read. I thought about the Conclave and its 47 species and its emergency sessions, and its 4-3 votes and its careful men who told you some doors were better left shut. "The Ovari," I said. "The archive says they disappeared 60 years after first contact with your species." "They did," she said. She held my gaze. "Not because of us. Because they made an enemy we were not yet strong enough to help them face. That failure has been part of our history for 4,000 years. It shapes everything we do. She set down her cup. We do not come back as the same species that watched the Ovari fall. We come back as something that has spent 3,000 years making absolutely certain it will never happen again. I looked at her. Outside the small window in the lounge, the stars were steady and bright. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "A voice," she said simply. "We cannot walk into the conclave chamber and announce ourselves. They will hear it as a threat, whatever words we use. Because we are unknown and unknown things look like threats until they have a story. You know us, you know the story. We need someone the conclave already trusts to stand up and tell the truth." She tilted her head slightly. "Will you do that?" I thought about Elder Ossak. I thought about the look on his face when he closed my terminal. I thought about careful people and the things they decided you did not need to know. I thought about 11 pages in a very old file, and a word pressed deep into the page in red. "Yes," I said for the second time that day. Walking through a human station for the first time is an experience that does not translate well into words. I have tried to describe it, and every attempt ends up sounding either like a travel report or like the kind of overexcited account that loses its audience halfway through the second paragraph. So I will try to be precise. The station was called the Meridian, which I later learned was a deliberate choice. The same name as the survey that first documented Terran civilization 4,000 years ago. It was not the largest of the human stations. Commander Kane told me this with a straight face, which meant she was not being modest. The Meridian was simply the nearest, the most accessible, and the one designated for first contact purposes. There were others. There were many others. The Meridian was approximately 300 kilometers from end to end. Along its inner ring, made possible by the kind of gravitational engineering that the Conclave's best scientists had theorized about for 2 centuries without making it practical, there were cities, not settlements, not installations, not outposts, cities with streets and parks and buildings of varying heights, with open markets and transit systems, with a kind of ambient noise that only exists when a very large number of people are living their ordinary lives all at once. I stood at the inner ring observation level, which curved away from me in both directions until it disappeared into haze, and I tried to count the lights. I could not count the lights. Kane gave me time to process. She did not rush me. She stood beside me at the railing, and let the scale of it settle over me without comment, which was a remarkably respectful thing to do. I had half expected a presentation, a briefing, a formal introduction, something structured and official. Instead, she had simply walked me here and let me look. "How many people live on this station?" I asked. "The Meridian supports about 40 million permanent residents," she said. "With seasonal population, it sometimes reaches 60. I nodded. The Conclave's largest orbital platform held 8 million, and it had taken 200 years to build. "How long did this take to construct?" I asked. "The Meridian was first habitable about 400 years ago," she said. "The current configuration took another century to complete. It has been expanded 3 times since." She glanced at me. We had time and motivation. She offered to take me to the archive access facility. I said yes immediately, which made her smile again. She had a habit of smiling at moments that I initially read as strange but gradually came to understand as expressions of something very specific, a kind of pleased recognition, as if she was constantly finding the world confirming something she had hoped was true. The archive was not what I expected. I had expected something formal, something sealed, something that would be presented to me with conditions and caveats. What I found was a room the size of a conclave assembly hall, lined floor to ceiling with interface terminals, staffed by several dozen people who were in the middle of their ordinary working day, and who looked at my arrival with polite curiosity rather than anything more guarded. Kane introduced me to the head archivist, a tall, easy-mannered man named Lewis who shook my hand in the human custom, and then told me I could access anything in the open collection without restriction. I asked him what the closed collection contained. He said, "Things that would be unhelpful to show you before you've had time to read. The open material. Not because we're hiding them, but because context matters and some things need to be understood in sequence." I respected that answer. It was honest and practical, and it treated me as an intelligent adult, which was more than I could say for most of the briefings I had attended at the conclave. I spent several hours in the archive. I read quickly, which is a skill the Academy trains into you, and I moved through the human historical record in something close to chronological order, trying to build the context Lewis had mentioned. The first section covered what humans called the long disappearance. 3,000 years ago, the Terran civilization had been at the height of its expansion. 14 settled systems, thriving trade networks, a population in the hundreds of billions, culturally rich, scientifically advanced, and, I noted this in my reading with a particular kind of attention, deeply aware of the political situation developing at the galactic core. The ancestor empire of the Vreth Dominion, called the Vreth Hegemony at that time, had been building toward a campaign of what they called civilizational consolidation for approximately 60 years. In practical terms, this meant the systematic absorption or elimination of any civilization within their expansion radius that refused to submit to hegemony governance. 3 civilizations had already been absorbed. 1 had been eliminated. The Terrans were within the expansion radius. A council of their senior leadership met over a period of 18 months to decide what to do. The record of those meetings was in the archive, transcribed in full, and I read large sections of it. The debate was extraordinary, voices on every side, arguing with genuine passion and deep disagreement, sometimes with anger, sometimes with humor, always with the underlying current of people who understood exactly what was at stake and refused to pretend otherwise. One faction wanted to fight. They had the capability, they argued. The hegemony was strong but not unbeatable. A defensive war, fought on favorable terms with adequate preparation, could be won. Another faction pointed to the Ovari. They had been strong enough too, they said. Strength is not sufficient when the adversary is willing to burn everything. A war against the hegemony, even a victorious one, would cost billions of lives. Not just Terran lives, but the lives of every smaller civilization caught in the blast radius of a conflict between 2 major powers. The damage would be generational. A third faction, small at first and then gradually growing, proposed something that most people in the early sessions dismissed as cowardly and impractical. Disappear. Not retreat, not surrender. Disappear. Remove the Terran civilization entirely from the hegemony's field of awareness. Scatter. Go silent. Let the hegemony conclude that there was nothing here worth conquering. Buy time. Not years, not decades, but centuries. Enough time to become something the hegemony could never threaten again. Enough time to build the tools needed to protect not just Terran civilization, but every civilization the hegemony might eventually target. The debate ran for another year. In the end, the third faction won, not by a comfortable margin and not without grief. Reading those meeting transcripts, I could feel the weight of what was being decided. Billions of people agreeing to vanish, to let the galaxy forget them, to endure whatever that meant for however long it took. The vote passed. The plan was implemented with remarkable speed and thoroughness. Colonies went dark. Ships withdrew. Records were seeded into galactic databases designed to look like evidence of collapse rather than departure. The cataclysm that the Conclave's archives recorded was fabricated, a carefully constructed story told in the language of debris fields and dead, communication arrays. Then the Terrans went somewhere else, and they went to work. I read for a long time. The hours passed without my noticing them. Lewis came by twice to bring me something to drink, which I drank without looking up. Around me, archivists moved quietly through their day, pulling records, cross-referencing data, doing the patient work of maintaining the memory of a civilization. 3,000 years of it. They had not spent those years in hiding. Not exactly. They had spent them building, studying, and watching. The watching, it turned out, was systematic, extensive, and carried out with a level of technical sophistication that made every surveillance capability in the conclave look like looking through a window with your eyes closed. They had monitored every major political development across known space. They had records of every expansion campaign, every extinction event, every war, every negotiation, every failed treaty, and every broken agreement. The record was enormous. And reading even a portion of it, I began to understand something that I had not understood before. They were not watching out of strategic interest. They were watching because they cared. The records of the extinction events were not filed under threat assessments or strategic evaluations. They were filed under loss. Each one documented with the specificity of grief rather than the detachment of analysis. Species names, population figures, cultural histories assembled from the scattered fragments that survived. The Terran archivists had spent centuries preserving the memory of civilizations that everyone else had forgotten, because they believed those civilizations deserved to be remembered. I came to a section that covered the last 50 years. The section was denser, more detailed, more urgent in its tone. The Vreth Dominion, the hegemony's modern successor, had been rebuilding, slowly, carefully, in ways that avoided triggering conclave intervention mechanisms. The expansion radius was growing again. The projected timeline aligned almost exactly with the 18 cycles Owen had identified. And alongside the Dominion's movements, carefully cross-referenced and annotated, was a record of something else. A pattern of small interventions, invisible to the Conclave, carried out over decades. A piece of information seeded here, a piece suppressed there, a record misfiled in an archive, positioned exactly where a curious junior attaché might find it. I stopped reading. I looked at the terminal screen for a long moment. Then I went and found Kane. She was in a corridor near the archive entrance, speaking quietly with a member of her crew. She saw my expression and ended the conversation without hesitation. "You misfiled the record yourself," I said. She did not look away. "Yes. You have been feeding information into the Conclave archive for years. Pieces of the Terran record, navigational anomalies, survey reports, all of it positioned to be found. Yes, by me specifically." She tilted her head slightly. "We have been watching the Conclave for a long time. Vale, we track careers. We look for people who have the right combination of qualities: curiosity, stubbornness, the ability to sit with an uncomfortable idea long enough to understand it rather than dismissing it." She paused. "You have been on our list for about 4 years. When you took the archive assignment, we moved the record. I processed that. The specific sensation it produced was not anger, exactly, and not betrayal. It was something closer to the feeling of realizing that a story you thought you understood had a different structure than you believed, and that you had been a character in it long before you knew the story existed. You manipulated me," I said. "We created conditions," she said carefully. "You made every choice yourself. We put the record where you could find it. We did not make you read it. We did not make you come here." "No," I said, "you just relied on me being exactly who I am." "Yes," she said, "we did." I stood with that for a moment. Then I said, "Was there anyone else on the list? If I had not taken the archive assignment?" She smiled. "There were 17 others we were watching. You were the most likely. But yes, was a backup." Something about that answer made me feel, oddly, better. Not because I wanted to be replaceable, but because it confirmed what I was beginning to understand about how humans thought. They did not rely on one path. They prepared multiple routes. They were stubborn and thorough, and they did not let a single point of failure become an ending. That quality had gotten them through 3,000 years of silence. I thought it was probably going to serve them well now that they had decided to stop being silent. "The Conclave emergency session reconvenes in 6 cycles," I said. "They will be expecting a report from the Vreth commander. Commander Drav is currently parked in dead space with his fleet and a great deal of time to think," she said. "He will be returned to function within the hour, as promised. What he reports is his choice to make. And what do you need me to do?" She was quiet for a moment. In the distance, down the long corridor, I could hear the sounds of the station, voices, movement, the ambient texture of ordinary life continuing without urgency or fear. It did not sound like a war civilization. It did not sound like a people preparing for conquest. It sounded like what it was: a people who had been patient for a very long time and had now decided it was safe to breathe again. "We need you to stand in the conclave chamber," she said, "and tell them the truth. Not a summary, not a diplomatic version. The truth with all its difficulty and all its weight. Tell them what you found, what you saw, what we are and what we are not." She met my eyes. "Tell them we are not their enemy. Tell them we have never been their enemy. And tell them that we are very, very tired of watching the galaxy hurt itself, and that we are here now, and that we would like very much to help it stop." I looked at her. I looked at the corridor, the station, the 40 million lives going about their ordinary day, inside a structure that should not have been possible and was magnificent. "They will be afraid," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "They will be afraid. Fear is reasonable. We understand fear." She glanced away for a moment, at something I could not see. "We were afraid too once, when we voted to disappear, when we let the galaxy forget us. That fear did not go away for a very long time." She looked back at me. "But we did not let it make the decision. That is what we want for everyone. Not the absence of fear. Just the refusal to let it be the one who chooses." I thought about that on the transport back. I thought about it for all 6 cycles of preparation. I thought about it standing outside the conclave chamber, with the sound of 47 delegations on the other side of a very large door. Then I stopped thinking and went in. The conclave chamber held 700 seats arranged in a descending arc around a central floor that the delegations called the speaking ring. I had stood on the speaking ring twice before in my career, both times for minor procedural matters that no one had paid much attention to. The first time I had been nervous, the second time I had been bored. This time I felt neither. What I felt was a very specific, very clear sense of purpose. The kind that arrives when every doubt has been examined and set aside, and what remains is simply the knowledge of what needs to be done. The chamber was full. Every delegation was present, which was unusual. Normally, the senior sessions drew perhaps 2/3 of the full council. Today, there were faces in every seat, and the ambient sound of 700 delegates preparing to be cautious and suspicious and afraid filled the space like weather. Elder Ossak was in his usual position, third row, Keth delegation, aisle seat. He saw me walk to the speaking ring. His expression did not change. He had, I now understood, known more than he admitted for longer than he let on, and he had made choices based on that knowledge. I did not resent him for it. People make the choices they believe will cause the least harm with the information they have, and sometimes they are wrong about what the least harm actually is. I stood in the center of the speaking ring. The chamber came to something close to quiet. I am Vale 9, I said, attaché to the 3rd Diplomatic Branch. I have no prepared remarks and no formal authorization for what I am about to say. I am going to tell you the truth as I have experienced it over the past several weeks. When I am finished, you are welcome to do whatever you decide with what I have told you, but you will have heard it. Someone in the Vreth delegation shifted. Commander Drav was in the back row, and I did not look at him directly. I had been told that he had returned to the station by a route that avoided the main docking facilities, which suggested he was not eager to be asked about the last several days. I started at the beginning. The misfiled record, the 11 pages, the cipher, Owen, the signal and what it said, the observer vessel and the journey, what I saw when the stars came back into focus at those coordinates, the Vreth fleet's engagement with the Patience, and what had happened to 40 weapons, discharges and 20 destroyers, Commander Kane, the Meridian, the archive, the 3,000 years of history that the Conclave had officially listed as the biography of an extinct species. I spoke for a long time. The chamber was quiet in the way that large groups of people are quiet when they are collectively holding their breath. I told them about the Ovari. I told them about the vote to disappear. I told them about the records of loss, the extinct civilizations cataloged not as strategic data but as grief. I told them about the watching, and the waiting, and the 18-cycle timeline, and why the humans had chosen this moment to speak. The Vreth representative started to rise from his seat at that point. The senior chair called for order with a gesture, and Drav sat back down. His expression was controlled, but something underneath it was working hard. I told them what Commander Kane had asked me to tell them, not a diplomatic version, the truth. I told them that the humans were not the galaxy's enemy, that they had never been, despite what fear would suggest and despite what the scale of their capability might imply. I told them that a species that spent 3,000 years in silence, when it could have spent them in conquest, was a species that had made a very clear choice about what kind of thing it wanted to be. I told them that the humans were tired of watching the galaxy hurt itself, and then I stopped. The silence that followed lasted longer than I expected. 700 delegates, 47 species, the full weight of the Galactic Conclave, holding its collective breath, in a large room on an orbital platform in the middle of an ordinary star system trying to process the idea that the most extraordinary development in recorded galactic history had been unfolding for 3,000 years, in the space between the stars that everyone agreed was empty. The first voice that broke the silence was not a diplomat. It was one of the junior analysts in the observation gallery, a young Paran, whose name I later learned was Sel, who called out from the upper tier, "Are they here now? Are they outside right now?" It was not a question that should have been asked from the observation gallery. It was a question that broke every protocol the chamber had. It was also exactly the right question. I looked up at Sel for a moment, then I looked at the senior chair who gave me the faintest nod. "Yes," I said, "they are." What happened next was not what I had been afraid would happen. I had prepared myself for panic, for immediate calls for military response, for the kind of reactive fear that turns into aggression before anyone has time to think. What happened instead was something I had not predicted. The windows opened. Along the outer wall of the chamber, the full-length observation panels that looked out into open space. A full 1,000 kilometers of material, running the entire circumference of the station's diplomatic ring, went to full transparency. It was an automated function, triggered from a source that bypassed the standard controls, and every delegate turned to look at the same moment. The human fleet was there. It filled the view from one edge to the other. Thousands of vessels in a formation that was not aggressive, not threatening, not designed to intimidate, simply present, simply visible. Every ship broadcasting a signal that scrolled along the bottom of every communication screen in the chamber in all 47 languages simultaneously. "We are here. We are not your enemy, but we remember everything." The Vreth representative was on his feet again. Drav's voice was tight and clipped, carrying the tone of someone who had decided that anger was safer than the thing it was covering. "This is a military demonstration," he said. "This is an act of coercion directed at the sovereign deliberative body of the Galactic Conclave. The Vreth Dominion will not." "Commander Drav," said a voice over the open channel. It was Commander Kane. She had been listening. "We have records," she said, "complete records, of every campaign your Dominion has run in the last 300 years. Every civilization absorbed, every culture erased, every agreement broken." Her voice was calm, entirely, absolutely calm. "We are not threatening you. We are informing you that the next campaign will not proceed the way you have planned. Not because we will stop you by force, though we certainly could, but because the 47 delegations in that chamber are going to read what we know, and they are going to make decisions that are no longer shaped by the assumption that no one is watching." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence before. It was the silence of a room realizing that the rules of the game had just changed, and that the change could not be undone. Drav sat down. He did not speak again for the remainder of the session. What happened over the next several hours was not a negotiation, exactly. It was something more uncertain and more real than a negotiation. It was a conversation, the messy, unscripted, multi-directional kind that happens when a very large number of different beings are trying simultaneously to process something new. Questions were asked. Many of them were the questions that Isel had started with, the simple direct ones that cut through the formal diplomatic language. "What are you? What do you want? What happens now? Are you going to stay?" I answered the ones I could. For the others, I turned to the channel that Kane had left open, and she answered directly, which was not standard protocol but was, I would argue, more honest than any standard protocol I had encountered. The session ran for 6 hours. At the end of it, no formal resolutions had been passed, no treaties had been signed, no agreements had been made. The senior chair acknowledged that the situation required a new kind of process, one that did not yet exist, and proposed a recess for 3 cycles to allow delegations to consult their home governments. It was, under the circumstances, a reasonable response. Careful and measured and perhaps a little slow. Very conclave. But something had shifted. I felt it in the chamber as people rose from their seats. The ambient quality of the conversation had changed, not from fear to trust. That would be too simple and too fast, but from the closed-off, held-breath quality of people refusing to look at something, to the more open, uncertain, curious quality of people who had decided, despite themselves, to look. Species who had not spoken to each other in formal sessions for decades were clustered in small groups at the chamber, exits talking quietly. Analysts from different delegations were comparing notes on their pads. Even a few of the Vreth representatives, not Drav, but others, were standing in conversation with delegates from smaller civilizations. Expressions that suggested the recent events had prompted some internal recalibration. I stood in the speaking ring for a moment after the chamber began to empty, looking at the view through the observation panels. The human fleet was still there, steady and vast and patient, holding its position without urgency, without aggression, without any of the qualities that power normally advertised itself with. I thought about patience. 3,000 years of it. A people who had looked at the galaxy and decided that the most powerful thing they could do was wait. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough to build what they needed. Long enough to become something that could not be erased, that could not be threatened, that could not be absorbed. Long enough to come back not as conquerors but as the thing the galaxy had not known it needed. Witnesses, rememberers, people who had watched everything and forgotten nothing and were willing, now, to say what they had seen. Elder Osak found me as I was finally leaving the speaking ring. He stood beside me for a moment, looking at the fleet outside the observation panels. "You read the full file," he said. "Yes. I put it where you would read it," he said quietly. I looked at him. He kept his eyes on the view outside. "I was on their list," he said. 20 years ago they contacted me. I was not ready to be their voice. I was too careful, they said. Too good at closing doors." He paused. "I told them there might be someone better. I kept watching for someone who read the right way, who got angry at the right things." He glanced at me briefly, then back at the window. "I kept the file available. I moved it to somewhere a junior attaché with archive clearance might stumble across it. I let the information settle. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because if I had told you," he said, "you would have come to it as a briefing, something handed to you. And you would have processed it the way we process briefings, efficiently, skeptically, with the part of your mind that categorizes and files." He shook his head slightly. "They needed someone who came to it as a discovery. someone who felt the weight of it in their own bones, without anyone telling them how to feel. He looked at me fully for the first time. That could only happen if you found it yourself. Outside the observation panel, one of the human vessels moved, slow and deliberate, drawing a wide arc through the formation that brought it closer to the station. Not a threatening movement. The opposite. A movement that said, clearly and without words, we are staying. I watched it for a long moment, 30 centuries of silence, ending in a room full of arguments and questions and fear and curiosity, which was probably exactly what the humans had expected. They had prepared for 3,000 years for this conversation, and they had prepared well. But I thought they had also understood, from the beginning, that no amount of preparation eliminates uncertainty, that the outcome of showing up after 3,000 years was never going to be clean or simple or guaranteed. They had shown up anyway. That, I thought, was the most human thing of all. Not the technology, not the patience, not the scale of what they had built in the dark. The decision to show up anyway, knowing it would be messy, knowing it might not work, knowing that the galaxy they returned to was frightened and fractured and likely to respond badly at first. They had done it because the alternative was to keep watching, and they had watched long enough. I was still a diplomatic attaché with a mid-level clearance and a small office and more questions than answers. I had no authority to speak for the conclave. I had no power to determine what came next. What came next would be decided, slowly and messily and imperfectly, by 700 delegates in 47 species and 2 civilizations trying to figure out what the galaxy looked like now that it had one more resident than anyone had planned for. But I was standing in a room where something had just changed. Not everything, not quickly, not without pain or difficulty, but something real and irreversible had shifted, and the shape of the galaxy was different than it had been when I woke up this morning. And it was going to keep being different from here forward. I had spent my career studying the records of civilizations that were gone. I had read their histories and cataloged their losses, and filed their stories under words that meant past and over, and remembered. I had not expected to be standing in the room where a legend decided to stop being passed. I had not expected to be the one who opened the door. But that was the thing about certain doors. You did not always choose them. Sometimes, if you were curious enough, and stubborn enough, and just willing enough to keep reading when everyone else had told you to stop, they chose you. Outside, the fleet held its position, patient, steady, and present, and for the first time in 3,000 years the lights were on.